Hi, my name is Aaron. I've been making bows for about 15 years on and off. Like a lot of people, I started my bow making journey by making a board bow. These bows were simply made from a red oak or maple board. These boards needed to have fairly straight grain with very few runouts from one end of the board to the other. I was able to find these boards at Home Depot or some of the local lumber yards in my area. Board bows were a great intro to the bow making process because they allowed you to learn how to use the different tools and develop the different techniques that you would be using later if you chose to move on to make a bow from a stave. Where I live in upstate New York, the woods that are available to me consist of hickory, maple, ash, and hop hornbeam, just to name some of them. The slideshow that you are watching shows the most recent bows that I've made. I made these bows for friends and people I work with. I don't sell my bows, but rather give them to the people that I know will appreciate them and enjoy shooting them. I've wanted to do a build along for quite some time now. I wanted to show the entire bow building process in great detail from start to finish, or should I say, from stave to bow. A lot of the information that I have learned when it comes to making bows I've acquired from YouTube, Trad Gang, Primitive Archer, and the book series Bowyer's Bibles. There are many people that I will try and reference throughout this build along. I have found that building bows can easily become an addiction, and not one I plan on giving up anytime soon. Ultimately, I would like to be able to harvest a white-tailed deer with one of the bows that I build. The initial build along will be shown through a series of pictures with voiceover commentary. I'm hoping that later on I will have the ability to film the different parts of the bow building process in hopes it will be easier to understand and follow along with what I'm doing. The first build along, and what I hope to be many, will be an ash longbow. I harvested a log while at work that had been thrown in a pile that wasn't even destined to be firewood. I was able to split it into 5 usable staves and have made bows for most of them. This build along series will be broken up into segments, starting with the initial rough out, width and thickness taper, tillering, and final finishing of the bow. So without further ado, let's get into this build along. For my current workstation, I use a stave press mounted to a platform and secured to the floor and wall. The setup is very sturdy, and I can get a stubborn stave with my draw knife and remove a lot of wood without worrying about it coming loose. I know, it's kind of a mess. I've recently started watching Organic Archer's YouTube channel, and I am envious of how clean and neat his shop is. This particular ash log was very clean and straight, with very few knots. I went down a few rings on the back of the bow because when I debarked the log, there was some tearing that went through the outer ring in a couple spots. I will do a tutorial at some point on debarking staves. This particular stave was 3.5 inches at one end, and at the other end of the stave it was about 3 inches, so not much different. The starting thickness was approximately 2 inches. The overall length of the stave was 66 3/4 inches. This is a good overall length if you want to get a 28-inch draw. You can get a rough idea on what you need for stave length by taking your draw length times 2, adding your handle length plus 2 inches. So for this build along, I will have a 4-inch handle with 2-inch fades for an overall length of 8 inches. I'm going to make this bow for somebody with a 28-inch draw. So if we go 28 inches times 2, that's 56 inches, plus 8, plus 2 inches, that's 66 inches. There's some wiggle room here depending on your experience level and the overall design of the bow, but that's a good place to start. This stave has a small amount of propeller twist, but we will address that later on in the build along. The first thing you have to do is start getting rid of some of the mass from the stave. I make a rough mark a 1/2 inch down on the sides of the stave all the way around by scribing a line with a Sharpie. From here, I make several curve cuts using a Japanese style pole saw along the belly side of the stave from the tips back towards the fades. I first saw this on Dreamcraft Archer's YouTube channel. It makes it very easy to get rid of a lot of wood really fast. All you have to do at this point is take a hatchet and a hammer and work from the tips towards the fades, wedging out the pieces of the limb that you don't need. I like to use my draw knife and flatten the belly as I go along. This helps keep the wood removal along your scribed lines right where you want it. At this point we're going to even up the overall width of the stave. This will make it a little easier when it comes to laying out the width taper on the bow limbs. I use my hand to scribe some rough lines and then my draw knife to remove the material. Now that the limbs are approximately the same width, I move on to making my fade transition areas. I use a pipe fitting with a radius that I can trace on the fade area, starting at the back of the handle to my fade reference at the current limb thickness. I use a rubber mallet with a round chisel and work both sides of the fade down, leaving a ridge in the middle. I can remove a good deal of this ridge with my draw knife and then get it closer with the hammer and chisel. Another way to do this is by making a few curve cuts like we did in the limb at the fade area and then removing those areas with the mallet and chisel. In my opinion, this method was a lot easier. A lot of bowyers lay their bows out from the back of the bow, but I've never been able to do that. Instead, I use the belly of the bow where I can clearly see the orientation of the growth rings. Now that the fades are roughed in, I draw a light center line down the limb following the grain orientation. I find the halfway point of the limb by measuring from the fade to the tip. I then make some reference marks an inch on either side of the center line out to the halfway point on the limbs. I have laid out the tips an inch wide at this point, which is quite wide, but they will get reduced during the next material removal. I can now scribe along the edge of the limb and my reference marks out to mid-limb. I then use a straight edge to make the taper from mid-limb out to the tips. From here, I use my draw knife to work down to my lines as close as I can get. At this point, we are getting closer to a final limb width, but there will still be at least one more reduction, so I can get pretty close to my lines without worrying. I purchased this draw knife after watching one of Dan Santana's YouTube videos. It was one of the best purchases I ever made. Next, I use a Shinto rasp to get right down to the line. This is by far my favorite rasp. It has a coarse and a fine side and makes quick work of cleaning up limb edges. I then take my card scraper and further smooth out the limb edges. Having smooth working surfaces makes it easier and more accurate to lay out your reference lines. When using a draw knife to remove material down to a reference line, you can get very close to the line if you pay attention to the angle that you are holding the knife. If it seems like you are going to go through the line, you can angle that blade away from the line towards the back of the bow. Remove small amounts of material at a time when you are getting started until you get more comfortable knowing the capabilities of the tool. The edge that the draw knife has makes a big difference as well. In my opinion, a sharp draw knife works much better for fine and precise wood removal. Like anything, practice makes perfect. I like to create a bevel by using the draw knife and angling up away from the reference line on the belly side, and then I work the side and the back until I've created a bevel along the length of the limb. You can now remove that bevel and make the side of the limb as perpendicular to the belly as you can. This is another skill that comes with time after working on several bows. At this point, the bow limbs are quite thick, and you will have what bowyers call a bow blank. In the next segment, we will go through the final rough out before we can get into tillering.